Well, once again, greetings everybody, and welcome to another episode in an exciting adventure in church history. This is an important session for a couple of reasons. One is we're finally going to talk about us, finally going to talk about Presbyterians in America, and it's important for that reason, but it's also important because it is my intention to make this our last session. We've got lots of material to cover. Whether I can actually cover it all in that period of time today kind of remains to be seen, simply because, again, there's a lot of material to cover, and of course I can get long-winded about all this stuff, but we're going to give it a try. Now, I'm going to be covering, as I said, lots of material, and going over a lot of these issues and topics far more briefly than I really wish was going to be the case. Every one of these every one of these topics could probably be a course unto itself. Matter of fact, if you were so desired, you could probably take any one of these topics, cut it into 1,000 tiny pieces, and write a PhD dissertation about it. But nevertheless, that's what we're going to try to do. If I stop talking about what we're going to try to do and actually get around to doing it, going to try to cover this last section in Presbyterians in America and make today our last session. Before we get into Presbyterians specifically in America, I remember ending our last session rather abruptly because I realized how long I had gone already, and I thought that I was into some pretty important material that I think weighs pretty heavily in our discussion about Presbyterianism in America. So I want to go back and pick up on that a little bit. Remember that we had talked about the Millerites, the expectation of the end of the world back in the 1840s didn't really happen. In fact, I shouldn't say it really did not happen. And it was called the Great Disappointment. And the Seventh-day Adventist Church came out of that movement. We also saw the rise of the Christian Science Church. So while those groups were, first of all, the Adventists worried about the second coming of the world, and there were other groups that were also thinking about that. There were then the Christian Scientists. They were focusing on the inner life of the spirit. Actually, they were a part of what you might consider the science of the mind movement, in which basically that came out of the middle of the 19th century, basically saying that the mind was in control of everything. We could control things with our minds, and there were scientific pseudo-scientific movements that came out of that science of the mind thing, and theology was certainly impacted by it. The whole idea of power of positive thinking, and the way that has developed over the last century really is all a part of that we control the world, we control everything by what's going on in our mind. And no doubt there's some truth to that. I mean, going all the way back to Marcus Aurelius, a Roman emperor and a philosopher, who basically said the quality of your life is determined by your thoughts. What's going on in your head's what it's really all about. But as far as that being able to control the world, things get a little bit iffy and all of that. But nevertheless, while they were looking at those kinds of things, there were others who were taking a new interest in making the Presbyterian world a better place to live. And it was in 1907 that a Baptist, again, talked a little bit about this last time, I'm going to expand on it though. In 1907, a Baptist minister named Walter Rauschenbach published a book called Christianity and the Social Crisis. And he followed that up with A Theology of the Social Gospel. Rauschenbach certainly understood himself to be an Orthodox Christian, but as he looked at the Bible, all the way not only into Jesus, but looking back into the message of the prophets in the Old Testament, he saw the call for justice as a theme running all through the Bible. And so he got around to saying that salvation must be understood not only as the conversion of the individual, but also salvation, he said, as a progress of society towards justice and fellowship, which he saw to be the essential characteristics of the kingdom of God. Well, that whole social gospel movement I think it's fair to say, an earthquake in not only theology, and probably less theology, than in just the way Christians began to see their task in the world. At least some Christians seeing what their task in the world was going to be. One example of all of that was that the work of Walter Rauschenbach had great impact on a young black Baptist pastor who was Martin Luther King Jr. He led in that the bus boycott, from which the civil rights movement, beginning in the 50s and continuing up into the 60s and on, I suppose you could say even into today, came out of that. And his having been influenced so powerfully by Rauschenbach and social gospel. Now, it's also, I think, fairly important to point out that there was an awful lot of pushback, as you can expect and as you can see around you today, a lot of pushback to this idea and the movement that King propounded and moved forward quite a lot. There were a lot of white pastors in the South, and I suppose beyond the South, who were also influenced by it and began to preach the teachings of this and also racial equality, and they lost their jobs. In fact, there was an organization whose task it was to help pastors who lost their job for preaching racial equality. And in fact, there were some churches who posted what they called temple guards, and their job was to make sure that no black people entered their churches. So some serious pushback to all of that. Well, anyway, there were also not just individual preachers and others who were influenced by social gospel. Denominations began to be influenced by it as well. And they endorsed movements for social justice, not only here in this country, but around the world. For instance, they stood in opposition to dictatorships in Latin America and in Africa. And a lot of this caused conflict between church leaders and members of the churches. Members of the churches were saying that the church leadership was taking them in directions that not only did they not want to go, they said it was in ways contrary to what the nature of the gospel was. In other words, there was this conflict between what is the gospel really all about? Is it all about social transformation, or is it about the conversion of the individual? Well, does it have to be an either-or thing? Well, of course not. But there are people who want to define it in that ways. Well, it did create that conflict between leaders and lay members of the churches. And there were a lot of church members who thought that their church leaders, far from representing their views, were moving towards endorsing things like labor unrest, or racial unrest, and labor policies that threatened their businesses. I mean, you're an owner of a small business, and your church is preaching that people ought to be organizing into unions and so forth. And yeah, your church is sort of betraying you and your own business interest. And they also said that the church was encouraging communism, and began to hear a hero speaking in the voice of Senator Joseph McCarthy, who said that communism was not only at work in churches, and I'm not sure how much McCarthy really ever said about churches, but he certainly said that there was communism in the government. And how many, I've forgotten, was his list said there was 56 members of the Communist Party in the State Department alone. He never produced a list of those people, but he got people to believe it anyway. Well, all of this, I don't want to say led to, but it certainly expressed a conflict between conservative versus liberal Christianity. And I'm not sure liberal is the right word there. In fact, I'm not sure conservative is the right word there either. I think, in fact, we probably have gotten a lot of these terms mixed up, maybe even turned upside down. I'm not sure about all of that, but it's possible, I think, that we have. But it doesn't really matter. There are labels that we lay on things. I think a better description today, maybe conservative versus progressive rather than liberal. But if you want to think of liberal and progressive being the same things, then that's fine. Again, a rose by any other name is still a rose. what are the differences between those two movements? This is a tremendous oversimplification, but I'll go ahead and make it anyway. We have to look at the roots of those words. What is the root of conservatism? It is conserve. And what it means is we've got to hang on to the values of the past. There were good old days and we've lost them, and we need to get back to them by reasserting their values. Progressivism, the root word there is progress. It says the world's changed and the solutions to the problems we face and may face in the future may not be the same as the solutions that they may have been able to turn to in the past. So anyway, that conflict is certainly there, and it is not new. As a matter of fact, as near as I can tell, at least tracing it back through American history, it pretty much goes all the way back. And we see it expressed certainly in church history and very specifically in Presbyterian church history. Well, not only did things like social gospel arise, and that was in the early part of the 20th century, but other things were happening as well, and some of them had begun to happen before the turn of the 20th century. Church members saw a change not only in their church leadership, but probably the change in church leadership had resulted from a change in, for instance, the denominational seminaries. The seminaries were no longer teaching what people thought was the traditional gospel, and they had been influenced by some things that people were terribly uncomfortable with. One of them was, and still is, it's just still a problem, the teaching of evolution. It was in the 1860s, or about that time, that Darwin wrote his works. He talked about how life forms on Earth came as a result of changes in the way organisms related to their environments, and therefore changed. And some people saw that as in tremendous violation of the story of the creation in the book of Genesis, which led to the other issue that people were concerned about as coming out of the seminaries, and that was that beginning in the late 19th century, particularly in Germany, there had come to be a whole new way of studying and taking a look at the scriptures. And that was called biblical criticism. Well, it's too bad it was called that, because criticism just sounds like criticizing the Bible, and that's not what it means. It just meant taking a very close look at the Bible, bringing modern scholarship to examine the Bible, and you started looking at things like, well, the books from the Old Testament, the books of Moses. Were these really written by Moses? And the scholar said, well, it looks like, to us, like it was written by a number of authors over a very long period of time, and probably instead of coming from Moses, maybe as far as 1,300 years before Christ, these books probably didn't come into their final form until maybe 500 years before Christ. And so there was all this disruption over this new learning and scientific thought and so forth. And this led to, you might call it, a backlash within the church. And one of the ways in which this backlash expressed itself was by a book that some Christians wrote, a series of books called The Fundamentals. These are the things that Orthodox, meaning right, Christians believed. And so there began to be, well, I'm not sure that the movement was new at that point, but people who subscribed to the teachings of those books that were called the Fundamentals, those people began to be simply known as fundamentalists. Well, as time went on, there were those in the fundamentalist camp who were unhappy with the narrowness and the judgmentalism that they saw in the camp, the intolerance, narrowness, so forth, in fundamentalist circles, and they were unhappy with all of that. And so they began to call themselves by a new name, and that new name was evangelicals. Their theology was probably pretty much the same, became more an expression of personality as much as anything else, and certainly a way of dealing with people who disagreed with them and so forth. I want to say just a word about that word evangelical. The word evangelical comes from a Greek word euangelion. It means good news. So evangelicals are those who believe in the good news. Well, Christians believe in the good news. Prior to that group calling itself by that name, all Christians were evangelical, and I believe all Christians are evangelical. You know, it's just another way of creating division, drawing lines, saying, those people over there are not like us, one way or another. But again, I simply believe that we all believe in the good news. We are called upon to share that good news, and that makes us all evangelicals. Okay, there are more things that could be said about that, but I really got to move on quite a lot here to get into talk. But I wanted to bring that up because it really does have real relevance into the way things have developed in Presbyterianism as it has developed and grown in America. You'll see that, I think, as we go through this material. Out on Long Island, there's a town called Jamaica, and there was a church. It was established there in the year 1672, and that church is still there, and it is probably correct in claiming to be the oldest permanent congregation in the United States with the name Presbyterian. However, there are churches in America that are Presbyterian churches now that are older than that. When I graduated from seminary, my first church, my first assignment as an assistant minister was out on Long Island. It was at the Setauket Presbyterian Church, which is on the North Shore of Long Island. And it was founded in 1660. It's considered to probably be the fifth oldest continually operating church in America. They may not have organized under the name Presbyterian, because there doesn't seem to be any Presbyterian churches around at that point in time, but it was certainly there, and a very historic congregation. And it certainly became Presbyterian, but I'm not exactly sure at what point that actually happened when they adopted that name. However, by the time of the Revolution, and in fact some years before the Revolution, they'd already taken a stand for separation from Britain, from independence. As a matter of fact, a certain group of those church members withdrew from the church, moved across the village green, and built an Episcopalian church. And they, of course, were those who were loyal to the crown, and those Presbyterians on the other side of the green were not. When the Revolution came around, the British occupied that area. In fact, they occupied what is now the Setauket Presbyterian Church. They tore down the tombstones to make fireplaces. They stabled their horses in the church. Matter of fact, if you saw the television series Turn about America's first spy ring, those first members of that first spy ring were members of the Setauket Presbyterian Church. I'm not sure all of them were. I never really watched that series, but the church was featured in that series. And not only did the British occupy and stable their horses in the church, the colonists actually attacked it. The church itself was the site of a battle in the Revolution. That structure that was there during that battle burned in 1811, and a new sanctuary, new church building was built in 1812. That's the one that currently stands. But the Episcopal church across the green, called the Caroline Episcopal Church, named after the Queen at the time of the building of that church, still does actually have some bullet holes in it from the Battle of Setauket. Okay, a little spam call on my phone about then. Anyway, a little history there. So that church is very historic. It's even older than the church in Jamaica, but not the oldest Presbyterian church in America. As a matter of fact, there's a church out in Southampton, New York, also on the south. This one's on the South Shore of Long Island. They claim their founding date is actually 1640, and think about it. That's actually only 20 years after the Pilgrims landed in Plymouth. Okay, moving on. One of the major figures in the history of Presbyterianism in America is a man named Francis Makemie. He was ordained and sent out as a missionary by his presbytery in Ireland. And he came to America in 1706. Well, actually, he came before that and began to establish churches all up and down the East Coast. But it was actually in 1706 that he and some other Presbyterian ministers formed the first presbytery in America. That's important. We are Presbyterian churches. We are a Presbyterian church. We are a member of a presbytery. What that means is that we are different from all those congregational churches that were around at that time. They were completely autonomous and independent, making their own decisions. And we're not quite like that. We have a relationship with other Presbyterian churches, and that relationship is significant. Probably the most important reason for its significance is that the Presbytery and the Synod and the General Assembly are really all about maintaining doctrinal purity. That's never as simple as it sounds, but when you are allowed to be on your own, you can go off in any direction you want. Well, we've got people that are sort of watching out for us, making sure that we're not going off in directions that we ought not to go. And that has some practical relevance too, in terms of such things as how properties are managed and so forth. And of course, there's an awful lot of Presbyterians who really think we ought to be congregational. We ought to make our own decisions. Presbytery shouldn't be involved. Well, we do make most of our decisions, and Presbytery doesn't get involved frequently, mostly in the call of ministers and in also the buying and selling of properties. But here's an example that I'm not sure I've ever seen it actually come into play, but it's always seemed to be a possibility. Let's say a church's membership declines, becomes somewhat smaller. There aren't that many voting members in the church, but there's another group of Christians in the community, started maybe in somebody's home. They don't have a building, and so how can they get a building? Well, how about if everybody goes over there and joins that Presbyterian church, gets some power through a sufficient number of votes and decides we're not going to be a Presbyterian church anymore. That could happen, and I suspect it has happened, although, again, I don't know of a specific instance in which it has. But the presbytery protects us from such things as that, and sometimes protects us from making stupid decisions. So it's not exactly a bad thing, even though sometimes we want to rebel and act like it's a bad thing. Nevertheless, soon after Makemie was doing all of his work, something very, very important in the history of Presbyterianism began to occur, and that was the Scotch-Irish immigration to America all the way throughout the 1700s. Now, one of the things to point out about this was that it really wasn't Irish at all. Maybe some of those people who came over here had married Irish or whatever, but it was not originally an Irish movement. And here's what I mean by all that. James I, you remember him, the son of Queen Elizabeth, who was a Protestant who took the throne of England and published the King James version of the Bible. Well, there was a problem in Ireland. Hard to believe, I know, but it's true. And so he decided that he would settle this Irish problem by slaughtering all of the rebellious Irish in the northern part of the country. Those that he didn't slaughter were driven out of Northern Ireland. So there was plenty of space there that needed to be repopulated, and he repopulated it by taking settlers from Scotland, England, and Wales and offering them cheap rents in Northern Ireland. So they went and began a life there. However, as we've seen already in our study of the Reformation in Great Britain, things were just changing all the time. This was not a change in religions, but eventually King James passed on, and several other people followed. And finally, one of them, after William and Mary had both died, the throne was taken by Queen Anne. And Queen Anne reversed the policy about Northern Ireland. She raised the rents, she placed severe restrictions on the people there, heavy taxes on those settlers, and so what did they do? They left. And where did they go? They went to America. They began in about 1715, thousands and thousands of them coming over here, and they brought with them their Presbyterian churches. And by the time of the Revolution, some 50 some odd years after the first wave of immigrants from Ireland came over, the Presbyterians were second in size only to the Congregationalists. And then the first General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church met in Philadelphia in 1789. Well, if you were a Presbyterian in the 18th century, 1700s, what would it have been like to go to church? I'm glad you asked that question. First of all, you would have been going to church in a very simple, unordained church. No stained glass windows, no statues, no artwork, nothing. Very plain, very simple. You would have also been preached at, and it's probably not a bad way of putting it, from a pastor who was in a very high and elevated pulpit looking down at everyone. There was also a lower pulpit where the song leader stood. And when worship began, it began with a morning prayer, and that morning prayer probably lasted about 20 minutes. Then there would be a lecture, which would be an exposition of the scripture that would be the sermon was going to be based on. There'd be another psalm, then there would be the sermon. Sermon probably would last about an hour, and it really didn't probably, we'd probably know we were hearing a sermon, but it was more like a lecture than it was what a sermon typically means to us these days. Although in an awful lot of cases, sermons seem like lectures, I'm sure. And the sermon was not read. The pastors in those days were encouraged to memorize their sermons. I'm not sure how people are being encouraged these days in terms of the delivery of sermons. I ought to know that. I don't remember anybody actually saying to me, this is the way you ought to do it. But they certainly taught us to write our sermons. And that actually, I thought, became a bit of a problem because we started treating sermons like they were some sort of academic exercise, and some pastors still publish their sermons, and a lot of us do, I guess, and those who do, and I've done it myself in the past, even have footnotes in their sermons, which is, I think, it's just sort of weird. A sermon is not a written document. It's an audio experience between a preacher and a congregation. And so it's very dynamic and not something that's simply written down, although there's value to that too. And I preached every different way, I suppose. I spent a lot of my life just preaching what they call extemporaneously, but that certainly was based on an awful lot of preparation. At this point, I have returned to the thrilling days of yesteryear when I have a manuscript typically right in front of me. I just do my best to read it well. So anyway, for whatever that's worth. During that service, which would probably, I'm talking about then now, not now, in those days, service would probably last a total of about 2 hours, after which they'd take a 15-minute break and go have lunch and then come back and do the whole thing again. So they really did spend an awful lot of time with that. Also, it's not just on what happened on Sunday. Home worship was expected from every member of the church. The father of the family was supposed to lead the family in home worship on a daily basis, and children were supposed to be taught to memorize the Westminster Shorter Catechism. And not only were the families of the church expected to do that, the minister or an elder from the church would stop by occasionally to see how it was all going. Are you doing the job? Are you doing it well? Are your kids learning the catechism? All that sort of thing. Well, then what about the celebration of the Lord's Supper? Calvin implied that he thought the Lord's Supper ought to be celebrated on a weekly basis, which we do, of course. But that's not what they did in those early Presbyterian churches. They thought that if you did it just on a weekly thing, it just sort of became a rote exercise and might not have as much meaning. So they wanted the celebration of the Lord's Supper to be a big deal. And so they turned it into a celebration. Required great preparation. The preparations for the celebration of the Lord's Supper might go on for weeks. The celebration itself might last from anywhere from 3 to 5 days. And before it happened, members of the session, the elders, who have spiritual responsibility before they have any other kind of responsibility, would go out and visit people in the parish and determine whether or not they were worthy of receiving communion, at which point they would receive a token. And when they would approach the communion table, they would present their token, and without the token, you didn't get communion. So things were different then than they are now. From the very beginning, Presbyterians did stress education. They did stress that their ministers had to be highly educated. That did result in the founding of the College of New Jersey, which is now Princeton University. And so if you attended a Presbyterian church in those days, one of the things you could depend upon is that your pastor had been well prepared and examined and sent out adequately educated to do the job properly. At least that was, well, they certainly tried to make that happen all the time. But that wasn't just the College of New Jersey. The Presbyterian Church, in stressing education, founded colleges and other seminaries all over the country, of course. And there are, I don't even have any idea, I don't even know how many for sure Presbyterian seminaries there are, 8 or 10, not quite sure, but there are certainly many colleges out there with Presbyterian founding and roots. I'm going to talk about the Presbyterian Church and the founding of the United States. During the Revolution, a member of the British Parliament said, "Cousin America has run off with a Presbyterian parson." Well, you can make that case to a certain extent, and I'll talk about it a little bit. But the reality is most Presbyterians were for independence. As a matter of fact, the Hanover Presbytery in Virginia was the first ecclesiastical body to take a stand and declare for independence. And all over the colonies, Presbyterians volunteered for the colonial army in great numbers. Many of the top leadership, high-ranking officers, were also Presbyterians. And we can go back now a little bit to this College of New Jersey. And when the member of Parliament said that Cousin America's run off with a Presbyterian parson, I don't know if he was thinking about this man in particular or not, but he may very well have been, because that man was John Witherspoon. He was a Scottish Presbyterian minister who came to America to be the president of the College of New Jersey. And he was there and did a tremendous amount towards preparing the country for independence. As a matter of fact, he was the only clergyman who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And he had tremendous influence on students. Now, his views, which grew out of his Presbyterian Calvinism, were, first of all, that God is sovereign, and therefore no king can claim absolute authority. Witherspoon also taught his students that humans are so sinful that they must have checks and balances. Kind of like what I was saying about our presbytery. Keep us in check. Well, human sinfulness has to be kept in check by checks and balances. Thirdly, God graciously provides government to curb all our evil intentions and to promote good. He also said, number 4, that human life in this world changes, and therefore a constitution should be flexible enough to meet changing conditions. Well, all of this had impact, again, on his students. One of his students was James Madison, who was known as the father of the Constitution. Madison stayed at the College of New Jersey and graduated in 4 years and hung on for an extra year just to study more under John Witherspoon. And of course, it would be way out of line to say that the Presbyterian Church was responsible for the formation of the American government, but you can see some influences at work there. Also, take a look at some of the students without individual naming of them. whom he also taught. Not only was there James Madison, the father of the Constitution, who was also a president, there was a vice president, there were 9 cabinet officers, 21 senators, 39 congressmen, 3 justices of the Supreme Court, and 12 state governors, as well as 5 signers of the Declaration of Independence. So there was someone, John Witherspoon, who did have tremendous impact through his teaching at the College of New Jersey. All right, well, we're going to move on. Start seeing some of the divisions that occurred in America and in the Presbyterian Church. I think I mentioned this last time, that the colonial America was not as religious and churchy as we oftentimes think that it is. In fact, I've heard it said that in colonial America, only 17% of the citizens were members of churches. But then when the United States was established and it called for freedom of religion, for an awful lot of people, they were exercising freedom from religion. Just weren't hanging around churches much at all. Now, that changed a lot after, if you remember the discussion about the Second Great Awakening, the revival that began in Cane Ridge, Kentucky, all the ecstatic utterances, people barking like dogs, rolling around on the ground and pleading with God for salvation and fearful of eternal damnation and all that kind of thing. And the impact that it had throughout the colonies and beyond the colonies out into the frontiers. Well, you know, there were Presbyterians who were leaders in the Second Great Awakening, but at the same time, Presbyterians were a little bit uncomfortable about the whole thing as well. First of all, the General Assembly of 1832 warned that undue excitement should be carefully avoided. Don't want to get too worked up about all this stuff. The second thing that the Presbyterians were concerned about was that the Second Great Awakening and some of the movements that grew out of it were really pushing this whole idea of decision. You have to decide to be a person of faith and to follow God. Whereas that didn't go well with basic Presbyterian Calvinism, which called for predestination. And again, that was a problem. We'll talk maybe a little bit more about that later. Is the decision, who's responsible for someone's salvation? People or God? Well, okay, don't get into some theological nitpicking here, but nevertheless, that was an issue that caused Presbyterians some concern during the Second Great Awakening. Now, there was also another problem that was arising during this time, and that was that the country was expanding westward, and there were a lot of people who were outside of the reach of cities and therefore outside the reach of ministers, and there was a press for how to fulfill the need of people for ministers. Of course, we talked last time about the Baptist pastors were also farmers, speaking the language of the people. Methodist, the circuit riders, and they expanded widely and became the dominant religions in much of America, and still the case today. But there were also Presbyterians who wanted to help meet that need, and one group of Presbyterians said, we've got to meet the need for ministers, but our pipeline cannot meet that need, so we've got to lower the educational standards so we can get some people out there. Presbyterian General Assembly said, no, we're not going to do that. So a whole new church was formed. It was called the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. The Cumberland Presbyterian Church basically, as I said, relaxed the standards on all of that. And you know, the Cumberland Presbyterian Church still exists today, but it's not fair to say that they don't have high educational standards for their clergy. They certainly do now, but at that time they wanted to meet the need for ministers. It might be a new name for you, Cumberland Presbyterian Church, because I looked, I tried to find them out. Where are they? Well, they're heavily in. It looks to me like Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, Kansas, Tennessee. A lot of them around in there. And I don't think there are any Cumberland Presbyterian churches in the state of Ohio, but they're a whole lot like us. And there are, good Cumberland Presbyterian schools out there as well. So even though that was where they started, that's not a very good description of them any longer. Okay, just wanted to say also just about this, we've seen some division right there among Presbyterians. There had other been Presbyterian divisions earlier, back during the very first Great Awakening, back in Puritan, Massachusetts, and Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield and on. There was, Presbyterians had divided into, they took up sides, old side and new side, and it caused a schism there back in the 1700s. However, they did eventually reunite, but the Second Great Awakening led to another one. And this time they called the division between the old school and the new school. So what do we see there? Those very names themselves. Conservatism versus progressivism. Old school, new school. But what was underlying the division? Sadly, it seems as though much of the reason for the division among Presbyterians came back to that old underlying issue of slavery in American life. What was the church going to do with slavery? Even as much as America didn't seem to know what to do with slavery, the churches didn't know what to do with it either. Back in 1787, the Synod of New York and Philadelphia stated that they highly approved the general principles of universal liberty, meaning abolition of slavery. But instead of condemning slavery, they instructed masters to be kind to their slaves and to make sure that their slaves heard the preaching of the gospel. Why didn't they take a greater stand than they did? Well, as some of them pointed out, the Bible nowhere actually condemns slavery. And as a matter of fact, at some points in the Bible seems to endorse slavery. This is going to be kind of uncomfortable, I think, but back in 1817, the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church actually had a solution. They recommended colonization of freed slaves back in Africa and instructed churches to take up an offering on July 4th to help subsidize that effort. And of course, that actually, I'm not saying it was all about Presbyterians because it wasn't, but the whole nation of Liberia, liberty, freedom, comes from slaves who were returned to Africa, as I understand things. And I don't want to pretend to be some kind of expert on the history of Liberia, but I'd like to know more about it than I actually do. But in 1836, the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church recommended that the whole issue of slavery just be postponed. Have to deal with it later. Okay, well, how did the church deal with it? After the war started, the Southern Presbyterian churches withdrew from the Presbyterian Church. They formed the Presbyterian Church in the Confederate States of America. Its General Assembly affirmed that domestic servitude, meaning slavery, is of divine appointment. And they said that it was the peculiar mission of the Southern Presbyterian Church to conserve the institution of slavery. Oh, there you go. Well, the Cumberland Presbyterian Church never divided, and it was soon after the war that the old school and new school Presbyterians did reunite. But the division between the Northern and the Southern Presbyterians, actually that division remained until 1983. I want to talk for just a very few minutes here quickly about Presbyterian missionaries that the Presbyterians sent out around the world. First of all, American missions tended to be within this continent. The earliest people the earliest Christians in America did preach, at least some, to the Native Americans, tried to convert them. But here's a quick little story of a woman named Narcissa Whitman. Narcissa from Connecticut, her life's ambition was to be a missionary to the Native Americans. And it finally got around to happening. She went with her physician husband and another couple, Henry and Eliza Spalding, and they headed out west, and actually still at a pass on the Oregon Trail, Narcissa and Eliza, there's a monument there, they're celebrated as the first white women to cross the Rockies. So they went on out to Oregon, they established a mission there, and Eliza was said to be a very beautiful woman. She was well known for her long auburn tresses. And in 1847, Narcissa was killed by Native Americans in Oregon, where they had established that mission, and they decided to keep her long auburn tresses, and you know what I mean. Another prominent American missionary was a man named Sheldon Jackson. Presbyterian minister, applied for foreign missions and decided that he just wasn't healthy enough to be sent out as a missionary, so he just became a missionary to unsettled parts of America, went out west, traveled 30,000 miles a year on foot and on horseback and on stagecoach, ox cart, sometimes by railroad. He was planting and promoting missions. He moved to Alaska, where he continued all his vast travels, sometimes using this time bobsled and canoe, founded churches and missions, schools. His repeated appeals brought federal aid for public schools in the area. It's said that his introduction of reindeer to Alaska was the economic salvation of the native population. Sheldon Jackson College still exists in Alaska as a tribute to his work. And actually 100 churches were formed out there by Sheldon Jackson. There were other missions all around the world. Real quickly, there was an African-American missionary named Henry Shepherd, Presbyterian missionary, went to the Belgian Congo in 1890. He also became well known in the United States as he traveled around preaching and raising money to support that mission back there. And sadly, it's said that he often, when he was traveling around America on train, had to ride with the animals because black people were not supposed to ride on trains with white people. And again, that was after the Civil War. Now, King Leopold of Belgium encouraged genocidal war there in the Congo, and the reason for these tribal wars that he encouraged was to hold on to the rubber business. Shepherd's protest led to his arrest and his trial, but that became heavily publicized, drew international attention to the exploitation of the Native Africans by colonial powers, and so therefore his work was instrumental in making some important changes in Africa. Also, 2 years after the Civil War ended, the Southern Church began a mission to China. After that, a mob banged on the door of a Presbyterian mission in China, and they were surprised when the door was opened by a woman. She spread her arms out wide and said, "Kill me, but let the others live." Well, the mob left, but they decided that they had left a little too early, and so they went back to the mission, and they hacked her to death. Her name was Mary Morrow. And then they went in to kill all the others at the mission station as well. But 20 years later, a certain general who was well known and respected at that time went back to the mission compound. He had been part of the mob that did the killing, and he requested baptism because he had never been able to erase from his mind the image of that heroic young woman offering to let offer her life up instead of those others who were in the mission. Well, American Presbyterians have a remarkable history of sending out foreign missionaries who did incredible work all around the world, preaching the gospel, building schools, building universities, building hospitals. Things have changed in the church and in the world. Mission activity is certainly different than it used to be. Protestantism Mainline Protestantism, and especially the Presbyterian Church, has gone through a time of reformation and deep change, so missions have changed as well. But we must not forget the contribution that the Presbyterian Church has made to world missions all around the world. All right, need to move on, but I do want to say a couple more things before we wrap things up here. Several things, actually. What about women in the church? Well, I think you all know essentially what that history is. Women were second-class citizens in the church for a very, very long period of time. And they traditionally were certainly not ordained. It was in 1880 that the General Assembly of the Southern Church explicitly said, quote, "The introduction of women into our pulpits for the purpose of publicly expounding God's word is an irregularity not to be tolerated." Well, things began to change, and no doubt it changed in large part because of the things that women were doing, contributing to the Sunday school movement, the way that they, the Women's Foreign Mission Society, and their support of missions around the world. It became something of a breakthrough in 1926 when the Southern Church's General Assembly met, and they affirmed the right of the president of the Women's Auxiliary to read her own report to the assembly. But they carefully worded things and warned her that she must not participate in any of the discussions on the floor of the assembly. Once again, only something that men ought to do. Now, it is the case also that the Cumberland Presbyterian Church did ordain a woman in 1889. It was not until 1956, however, that the Northern Church first ordained a woman minister, and then the Southern Church followed in 1964. Okay, there have been a number of changes that have gone on, and this is kind of where I was implying at the earlier part of the discussion about conservatism and progressivism and so forth. Wow, boy, that has been just a struggle throughout our history. What's that all about, really? And I don't know other than to say there just maybe seems to be two different types of people. One are drawn to the more we've got to conserve, and others saying no, we got to progress. What's the difference in those people? I couldn't possibly try to answer that question, but nevertheless, those different people exist, and it's caused all kinds of division and all kinds of pain, and the divisions and everything certainly occurs. Those differences began to be again affected by developments such as scientific discoveries, evolution, the biblical criticism that were being taught in the seminaries, and again, people were being influenced by the social gospel, and they thought the world needed to be reformed according to God's word, according to the call for peace and for justice. And in fact, there were those who looked at the situations in the world and in the church, and they thought the world seemed to be progressing toward the kingdom of God, or a world of justice and mercy and peace. However, 2 world wars kind of knocked that whole idea in the head that we were progressing toward a kingdom of justice and peace and so forth. So you had to kind of like reevaluate. And there was some reevaluation that was done, and there was a movement in theology, and it certainly has impacted the Presbyterian Church significantly. It was called Neo-Orthodoxy. And what Neo-Orthodoxy did was it enabled theologians and people who cared about these things to combine this critical, historical approach to the Bible and incorporate scientific discoveries and so forth, to combine all of that with the essentials of traditional Presbyterianism, emphasizing Calvin's view of the sinfulness of human nature, and that humanity's only hope was in God. We weren't going to be able to trust ourselves to turn the world into some sort of perfection. It wasn't going to happen. We needed God. We ourselves did not have the ability to pull that off. And all this was expressed in some of the ways that the Presbyterian Church developed and itself progressed through the 20th century. In the year 1991, the Presbyterian Church, that's again after the Reformation, or after the reunion of the Northern and Southern Church, adopted what we now have as one of the two parts of our church constitution, the one part being the Book of Order, the other being a Book of Confessions. And this Book of Confession contained ancient confessions throughout the history of the church, and some newer confessions as well. One of them was the Barmen Confession that was produced by German Christians standing up to the nationalistic church of Germany as it supported Hitler and Nazism. And then there was also a confession that was written in 1967 that became part of our Book of Confessions. It affirmed Presbyterian doctrine in terms of reconciliation. And then there was a brief statement of faith that came out some years after that, which also briefly recounted and affirmed the biblical story. It endorsed the ordination of women, and it spoke of God as mother as well as father, and it summoned Presbyterians to hear the voices of people who were not often heard or who had been long silenced. Well, this Book of Confession is a valuable document. When people are ordained to office as minister or elder or deacon in the Presbyterian Church, we all are, one of the vows we take, we're probably not thinking very much about it, we say that we're going to be guided by the confessions. Well, guided by the confessions is very important, but it does not say, I will be bound to the confessions and live according to every word in the confessions. If it did say that, I don't think I'd be able to be here. There are some parts of the Westminster Confession of Faith that I'm just simply not in agreement with, and that's probably true for most of you as well. But nevertheless, we've got a Book of Confessions, and it is a magnificent document, as is our Book of Order, by the way. We spent hundreds of years pounding out the Book of Order, make sure that it operates the way we think a church ought to be operated. Okay, so we've seen a lot of splintering and division, reunions still happening. In 1958, the Northern Presbyterians united to form the United Presbyterian Church in North America. Often here talked about as the old UP. And it finally did merge then with another group to become the United Presbyterian Church in the United States of America, which may be the one that many of us joined. That's the Presbyterian Church that I joined in 1979. But then it was in 1983, obviously just 4 years later, that the UPC USA, sounds an awful lot like our name now, but it really wasn't quite the same. Those words were all spelled out, merged with the Southern Church to form the Presbyterian Church USA. Well, that certainly didn't end the splintering. After that 1983 union came about the biggest Presbyterian schism of the 20th century. About 10% of the congregations of the old Southern Church withdrew, many of them joining the Presbyterian Church of America. And one of the big issues there was the ordination of women. Because the Presbyterian Church in America, which is out there, I'm not quite sure where the closest one is, it's a significant denomination. They adhere to the old idea that women must not be ordained. But there was that splintering that occurred over the ordination of women, people leaving the denomination, and we've certainly seen that pattern continue on through our time and in recent memory with the discussion of gay and lesbian rights in the church, with many churches withdrawing to join the Evangelical Presbyterian Church or something called the Covenant Order of Presbyterians, abbreviated ECO. Well, you've already gotten the idea here, I think, that we're not the only Presbyterian church around. Last couple of minutes I want to spend here is just basically on letting you know what other Presbyterian churches are out there. that we are PCUSA. We are the largest of the Presbyterian denominations. We have about 9,000 congregations, about 1.3 million members. We've experienced regular, consistent, massive decline to reach that point. There are all kinds of reasons for it. No doubt part of that reason is those who consider themselves more conservative than what they see the rest of the church to be having left. But that's by no means the only reason. An awful lot of it has to do with demographics, with the aging of our population, and the fact that we did not have as high a birth rate, and many of our kids didn't hang around, and maybe you could blame our Sunday school program or whatever you want to do. Also, it's just sort of things like, where were all the Presbyterian churches? Well, they were in inner cities, and they were in small towns. What happened to the people in those places, especially those who became or were Presbyterians? They left those small towns, they left the inner city areas. That certainly had impact on our church. And it's very complicated. Nevertheless, just so you'll know, 37% of our PCUSA churches, 37% have from 1 to 50 members. Another 23% have from 50 to 100 members, which means that 60% of our congregations have fewer than 100 members. The average attendance in Presbyterian churches is 77. Of course, that is skewed by the fact that we do have some very large churches with very large attendance figures. Some of the others, the Cumberland Presbyterian Church, 709 congregations, just so you'll know again, compared to 9,000 of ours, and they have 70,000 members. The Cumberland Presbyterian Church in America is an African American denomination, and they have 153 congregations. The Presbyterian Church in America, which I talked about a little bit ago, they have 1,900 congregations and 380,000 members. There's also something called the Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church. They have 300 congregations and 40,000 members. The Evangelical Presbyterian Church, which I mentioned a bit ago, they now have 600 congregations and 145,000 members. There is a Korean Presbyterian Church, that's here in the U.S., people of Korean heritage. Presbyterian Church has been very strong in Korea, so they brought their Presbyterianism with them. And the Korean Presbyterian Church has 300 congregations and 55,000 members. There is an Orthodox Presbyterian Church denomination. They have 280 congregations with about 30,000 members. There is a Reformed Presbyterian Church of North America with 100 congregations and 7,000 members. And a denomination called the Bible Presbyterian Church with 23 congregations and 3,500 members. There's a couple of other denominations, several others that are just like us. For instance, there's the United Church of Christ. We have those churches around here. We also have churches that still have the name out front, Congregational. They're probably all UCC, United Church of Christ congregations now. The Congregational churches united with the Evangelical and Reformed German congregation, German Reformed churches in 1957 to form the United Church of Christ. They have slightly less than 5,000 congregations and 800,000 members. So a bit smaller than us, but not all that much. There's also the Reformed Church in America, which is the oldest denomination in America. It was formerly the Dutch Reformed Church. It often shares in producing educational materials with our denomination. They have 100 congregations and 7,000 members. There is the Christian Reformed Church. It's an offshoot from the Reformed Church in America, and they have 700. Actually, I may have gotten that backwards. Nevertheless, the Christian Reformed Church is out there, and they have 750 congregations with 270,000 members. The Reformed Church in the United States, that's the smaller one, the breakoff, I think, that I was thinking of. 49 congregations and 3,000 members. And then there is the Hungarian Reformed Church in America with 23 congregations and 6,000 members. And just to reiterate, remember that when you hear the word Reformed, you're not simply thinking of, the word is not equivalent to Protestant, meaning not Catholic. There are Lutheran churches which, by theological definition, are not Reformed. We are Reformed, meaning we're followers of John Calvin. The difference is only basically that those people came here from the European continent and formed their churches, which were Reformed, and those people came from Scotland and from Northern Ireland, and when they got here, formed Presbyterian churches, all basically the same theology, following the church government established by John Calvin. Well, I could talk about this stuff for a lot longer, but it's probably hard to believe, isn't it, that I could talk much longer, but nevertheless, we have covered a tremendous amount of material. If you have hung in there through this whole time, I do greatly thank you. I hope that you have found this to be helpful and maybe even enjoyable. So thank you very much for your attention, and we're through playing now. Take care.